30s, 40s, whenever you were born, subtract 100 years. That's all it is. Go back 100 years, and this could be us. That's how close it is. So when we think of this being ancient history, it is not. The story I'm going to begin with about women is Cynthia Ann Parker. Not a well-known story, but this particular picture was very controversial. This was taken around 1861. And of course, she's nursing her baby. And you can imagine the 1860s, how controversial this picture was. Cynthia Ann Parker was born in Clark County, which is southern Illinois, in 1827. Her father, Elder John Parker, was recruited to settle his family in Texas. Recruited being they were in search of free land. Generally, what would happen in southern Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, those areas were subject to droughts, floods, and so on. Very difficult to run a farm there. And he saw the option of attractive land in Texas and so on. Cynthia moved with her family as a young child to an outpost in Texas on the headwaters of the Navasota River. It was a hard scramble life. You can tell from the picture, it's a hard scrabble life. And of course, the routes to get into Texas were not easy ones by any means. And Texas was in great turmoil in the 1830s. There were attempts to colonize the territory by Mexico, promising land in exchange for farming and religious conformity. All of the issues involving independence, Indian warfare, Mexican dominance, Texas independence, and slavery formed the perfect storm. Let's also understand the time and context. Our country was 60 years old. It occupied less than half the current geographic territory. In all likelihood, our great-great-grandparents were alive during this era. In the spring of 1836, the Battle of the Alamo was a pivotal event in the Texas Revolution. All the defenders were killed. But Santa Anna's perceived cruelty during the battle inspired many Texians to join the Texian army. Buoyed by a desire for revenge, the Texians defeated the Mexican army at the Battle of San Jacinto on April 21st, 1836, ending the revolution and gaining independence for Texas. It was not a long war, but the Battle of San Jacinto, waged by Sam Houston, was categorically a victory and gained independence for Texas. Fort Parker, in the meantime, was a settlement, became a fort as protection against the natives of the area. It was a church settlement headed by Cynthia's grandfather, who headed the Texas branch of the Primitive Baptist Church. They also created a company of the Texas Rangers. The Texas Rangers they have a storied history. It's really remarkable because these essentially were all volunteers. They were paid nothing, perhaps $5 a month. They had to provide their own horses, saddles, weaponry, everything they had to provide on their own. But what they tried to accomplish with just a very small force in a huge area is pretty amazing. This particular song really describes what the life of a Texas Ranger was. Come all ye Texas Rangers, wherever you may be, I'll tell you of some troubles that happened unto me. My name is nothing extra, so that I will not tell. And here's to all you Rangers, I'm sure I wish you well. Was at the age of 17, I joined the jolly band. We marched around San Antonio, down to the Rio Grande. Our captain, he informed us, perhaps he thought it right. Before we reach the station, boys, you'll surely have to fight. And when the bugle sounded, our captain gave command. To arms, he shouted, and by your horses stand. I saw the smoke ascending, it seemed to reach the sky. And then the thought it struck me, my time had come to die. I saw the Indians coming, I heard them give a yell. My feelings at that moment, no human tongue can tell. I saw their glittering lances, their arrows round me flew, and all my strength had left me, and all my courage too. We fought for 9 hours fully before the strife was o'er. The likes of dead and wounded I never saw before. And when the sun had risen and the Indians they had fled, we loaded up our rifles and counted up our dead. And all of us were wounded, our noble captain slain. The sun was shining sadly across that bloody plain. 16 brave rangers that never roamed the west were buried by their comrades with arrows in their breast. And now my song is ended, I guess I've sung enough. The life of any ranger, you see, is very tough. And if you have a mother that don't want you to roam, I'd advise you by experience, you'd better stay at home. John Parker, the family patriarch, had early experience as a fighter, soldier, scout, and Indian negotiator. He negotiated treaties with many of the local tribes, believing that these relationships would protect the settlers. The Comanche Indians were considered by many to be the most powerful Indian tribe in American history. Their skills in making war, horsemanship, and survival made them almost unique in Western history. They were also considered to be one of the most cruel and warlike tribes, but their survival interest was motivated by the annihilation of the buffalo and the loss of their hunting grounds. They were formidable opponents who developed strategies with weapons for fighting on horseback. Warfare was a major part of Comanche life. Raids into Mexico traditionally took place at full moon, as they could see to ride at night. Long known as warlike and aggressive, some estimates state that up to 20,000 people were kidnapped. Unfortunately, the Comanche Indians did not treat captives well, considering them little more than a slave and a commodity. From the moment of their capture until their death or release, they were both physically and mentally abused. Comanche was this area within the circle, generally took much of Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and so on. But Comanche was wherever the Comanche went. They refused to accept or agree to any treaties. They were perhaps the most warlike and fiercest tribe that would steal, trade, make war with anyone, Mexicans, other tribes, and Americans. On May 19th, 1836, a force of some 500 warriors, mostly Comanche, attacked Fort Parker. The Fort Parker massacre caught most of the settlers in the open, and they were overpowered. The men and women were tortured and murdered. Cynthia Parker and 5 other captives watched in horror and were led away into Comanche territory. The other 5 captives either fled or were released, but Cynthia remained with the Comanche for nearly 25 years. Her life with the Comanche was rough at first, abused and treated as a slave until being put under the care of a couple to raise her as their own. Under her native name of Naura, she quickly adapted, and around 1840 she married Chieftain Peta Nakona, who had participated in the raid at Fort Parker. Over the years, searches for Cynthia continued, and in December of 1860, Texas Rangers made a surprise raid, and she was recovered and returned to remaining family members. She remembered little English, but was reunited with family. Her return captured the imagination of the country and encouraged other families to seek other kidnapped victims. This is the photo, again, of Cynthia Ann with her daughter, Top Santa, also called Prairie Flower. Photo taken in 1861. We can never quite understand how Cynthia Ann Parker felt returning to civilization. She had lived in a primitive culture of endless and exhausting work, packing thousands of pounds of buffalo meat onto mules, covered in blood and grease, a world of ceaseless toil, hunger, constant war, and early death. The women did all the work. The men only fought and hunted for food. And they used every part of the buffalo. Nothing on the buffalo went to waste. Bones, organs, obviously the skin, and so on. On the other hand, we can never quite understand how Cynthia Ann Parker felt returning to civilization. This primitive culture was also pure magic, of beaver ceremonies and eagle dances of spirits that inhabited springs, trees, rocks, turtles, and crows. A place where people danced all night and sang bear medicine songs. Dream visions dictated tribal policy, and ghosts were alive in the wind, living on grassy plains and timbered river bottoms from Kansas to Texas. Quanah Parker, Cynthia's son, was a Comanche chief, but was not the only one. The Comanche were never organized under a singular leadership. Quanah Parker saw the reality of his destiny. He founded the Native American church movement and embraced white culture and became a successful businessman. He became friendly with President Theodore Roosevelt and was recognized by most as a great leader. Quanah Parker, Quaddy Comanche chief. Quanah Parker, businessman. The last Comanche chief. The only known portrait of Cynthia Ann Parker, taken shortly before her death. She witnessed terrible acts of torture and murder as a child. She assimilated into a hostile culture and adapted to a new life. She married and raised 3 children, one of whom became a great leader. After 23 years, attempted to re-enter her old family life, but not successfully. She lived as a proud mother, wife, and family member in 2 different cultures. She was first buried there. And then she was reburied by her son, Quanah Parker. One of the interesting things, she was reburied in Fort Sill. Interesting thing is that Quanah Parker kept her name. Very unusual. I don't remember any other situation like this in history, where a son, an Indian chief, kept the name of his mother. The Searchers, a movie by John Ford, 1956, starring John Wayne, considered to be one of his best, was believed to be inspired by the 1836 kidnapping of Cynthia Ann Parker. Comanche Moon, part of the Larry McMurtry series, Lonesome Dove. This is the true story of Cynthia Ann Parker. 2 books about her. In the movie Comanche Moon, Rangers Cole and McRae lead soldiers into a Comanche camp where they find Cynthia Ann Parker. A scout remarks that it would be more merciful to shoot her, since readapting to her old life was really impossible. And it was difficult. Cynthia Ann, when she was repatriated and brought back, life was miserable for her. She attempted to escape almost 20 times and was always recaptured and brought back. But they were repatriated wives and daughters were treated terribly. They were considered shabby material. Decades before the American Revolution, lamented that made the trip. Total about 300,000 to 600,000. The trail did not follow the Lewis and Clark Trail. They went in a different direction. The Oregon Trail was really mapped, much of it by Kit Carson, to really, in a sense, make it easier to go through the mountains. That's what our country looked like in 1842. Not much different than it looked like, in 1804 when Lewis and Clark set out. You look at all the Northwest, even though that was part of the Louisiana Purchase, it was all unorganized. And Oregon itself was really under joint occupancy by the United States and Britain. And of course, Mexico owned all of the West and Southwest. That's the Oregon Trail. That's the Oregon Trail mapped over the mountains. You see that they attempted to avoid the mountains, but they couldn't. Why would anyone take this trip? Some keep moving west. Some want or need free land. Some are just adventurers. Some were fleeing troubled areas and disease. Some were seeking religious freedom. Some were just running away. Life on the trail was the hardest for women and girls. They had no choice, and they followed their men. It's an old folk song. Remember, many of these songs were actually composed on the trail because they really had nothing else to do. Oh, don't you remember sweet Betsy from Pike, who crossed the wide prairie with her lover Ike, with 2 yoke of oxen, a big yellow dog, a tall Shanghai rooster, and 1 spotted hog. They soon reached the desert where Betsy gave out, and down in the sand she lay rolling about, while Ike, half distracted, looked on with surprise, saying, Betsy, get up, you'll get sand in your eyes. The Indians came down in a wild yelling horde, and Betsy was scared they would scalp her adored. Behind the front wagon wheel Betsy did crawl, and there fought the Indians with musket and ball. They swam wild rivers and climbed the tall peaks, and camped on the prairies for weeks upon weeks. Starvation, cholera, hard work, and their slaughter. They reached California in spite of hell and high water. There's about 400 verses to this song. The interesting thing is they finally got to California and they got divorced. Sorry. Women married early in those days. 14-year and 15-year-old wives were common. Typical situation would happen that a southern Illinois farmer having many, many children with his wife would die, obviously just from childbirth alone. The man needed a wife, and he decided to go west for free land and so on. He would go to his neighbor and say, whose neighbor was having the same problems. He would say, can I have your oldest daughter, who's maybe 15 years old? And she would become the new mother. And she would be mother to a number of children, many of whom were older than she was. And imagine a young girl, just married, leaving her parents, knowing she'll never see them again. The women on the Oregon Trail had the most difficult and unpleasant task. They fed the family, caring for the children and the sick, mending, washing, and carrying the water from rivers and streams, preparing all the meals. Imagine doing every task plus walking in the desert, wearing long dresses which got dirty and were a fire hazard when cooking. They had to drive the wagon team. They had to learn to shoot to defend the camp against thieves and Indians. This is Independence Rock, a huge rock, looks like a giant whale in the desert. And they would inscribe their name of their wagon train on there and their names, any messages and so on. It's still there today. Sickness, disease, and injuries were constant companions. Their only medicines were physicking pills, castor oil, rum, peppermint, and laudanum. There are hundreds of diaries from the women on the Oregon Trail. They're absolutely so compelling. I just took a few extracts from these diaries from different women, voices from the women who went on the trail. We met a man going back who had buried his wife that morning. She died from measles. Our wagon train has 50 wagons and 1,000 head of stock. It stretches more than a mile. Esther Hannah, an 18-year-old minister's wife, wrote, winds were high, had to haul water and wood and bake tonight. It's hard to cook with wind and fire blowing and shivering with cold that makes your teeth chatter. Charlotte Stearns Pengra in her 1853 journey. I hung out what wet things in the wagon, made griddle cakes, stewed berries, 2 loaves of bread, a pan of apples, and potatoes and meat for breakfast. Mended a pair of pants for William. Pretty tired. That's before breakfast. The inside of a wagon. They didn't ride on the inside of the wagon. They carried their belongings. They carried their food. They walked. Some of the wagons were far from elaborate. Lavinia Porter, a wife of almost 20 and pregnant, on her way to Pikes Peak and Gold. We passed hundreds of new-made graves in this part of our route. On this day, we overtook a wagon with only a man and his wife. She had given birth to a child the day before. The baby only lived a day, and they buried it in a tiny grave by the wayside, with the mother grieving her heart out. Abigail Scott Dunaway walked the Oregon Trail with her family at age 17. Elvina Apperson Fellows was 10 in 1847. Her father died on the trail and her mother finished the trip. When we reached Portland, it was my mother and 9 children. We had no money, and my mother would go to shops and get washing to do. Margaret Inman in 1852. I carried a motherless babe 500 miles, and when we would camp, I would go from camp to camp in search of kind women to nurse the baby. No one ever refused me. Jane Kellogg in 1852. There was an epidemic of cholera. I think it was caused by drinking water from the holes dug by campers. All along was a graveyard with people burying their dead. Such a terribly sad sight. Martha Ann Morrison in 1844. She was 13 years old and wrote about the strength of the mothers on the trail. The mothers had the family directly in their hands and were with them all the time, especially during great sickness. They had undergone more trial and suffering than anyone else. Those are the Grand Teton Mountains. This mountain range right here between 9,000 and 10,000 feet. Not terribly high as Rockies go up to 16,000, 17,000 feet. But you can imagine what the pioneers saw when they first went west, this barrier of mountains. They were coming from maybe the Appalachians, which were 5,000 or 6,000 feet. And of course, our irregular hills. But here they would see the barrier of a mountain. You can imagine what their thoughts were. How many people didn't survive the trip? It's believed that some 20,000 died on the trail from disease, cholera, smallpox, measles, flu, etc. Many died from accidents and about 400 were killed by Indians. It's estimated that about 400 Indians were killed by travelers. What happened to the Oregon Trail? It was in regular use from the early 1840s to the 1870s. When the Union Pacific completed the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, travelers started taking the train to San Francisco and then went north by ship to Oregon. However, wagon trains were still seen in the 1880s. This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. As I was walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway. I saw above me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. I roamed and rambled and followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts, and all around me a voice was sounding. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. Women on the Oregon Trail were truly women of valor. Chapter 3, Annie Oakley, a woman of valor. She was an American sharpshooter. Her amazing talent first came to light when she was 15 years old. She was born in a log cabin in southern Ohio. She was one of 9 children. Her father died, and the family, in poverty, rented her out as a servant. She began as a child to trap and shoot to support her family. She was so skilled at shooting that she sold game to restaurants. Her skill enabled her to pay off the family mortgage. I ain't afraid to love a man. I ain't afraid to shoot him either, said Annie. A traveling show marksman, Frank Butler, challenged her to a shooting match, and Annie won. They fell in love, and they were married a year later. They joined the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. They toured internationally, and her skills improved. In 1904, the newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst published a false story that Annie had been arrested for stealing to support a cocaine habit. The story was false, and most newspapers retracted the story. Annie spent most of the next 6 years winning 54 of 55 than her cost, but she restored her reputation. Hearst was a notorious man. He is reported to have really started the Spanish-American War strictly for the purpose of selling newspapers. In spite of injuries and ill health, she continued to shoot and set marksmanship records. She engaged in quiet philanthropy for women's rights and other causes. She raised money for the Red Cross. She died in 1926 at age 66. She and Frank were married for 50 years and had no children. Her successful career provided her family and her many charities a large fortune. Her life story was memorialized in a Broadway show and movies. A museum in Ohio commemorates her many accomplishments. The sun is sinking in the west. The cattle go down to the stream. The redwing settles in the nest. For a cowgirl to dream. That's where good companions, just my rifle, my pony, and me. Gonna hang my sombrero on the limb of a tree, darling. Just my rifle, my pony, and me. My rifle, my pony, and me. Whippoorwill in the willow sings a sweet melody, riding to Amarillo. Just my rifle, my pony, and me. No more cows to be roping, no more strays will I see. Round the bend, he'll be waiting for my rifle, my pony, and me. My rifle, my pony, and me. Aim at the high mark and you will hit it. No, not the first time, not the second time, and maybe not the third. But keep on aiming and keep on shooting, for only practice will make you perfect. Finally, you'll hit the bullseye of success, said Annie. That's a historical mile marker in Ohio, denoting her place where her museum is. National Geographic's award-winning photobiography of Annie Oakley, the stirring story of an enduring American heroine, has won widespread acclaim and was named the School Library Journal Best Book of the Year. Her hardships are examined too, as is her inspirational status as a role model for women. Annie Oakley, a woman of valor. This is the last cowboy song, the end of 100-year waltz. The voices sound sad as they're singing along. Another piece of America's lost. He rides the feedlots, clerks in the markets, on weekends selling tobacco and beer. And his dreams of tomorrow surrounded by fences, but he'll dream tonight of when fences weren't here. He blazed the trail with Lewis and Clark, and eyeball to eyeball, old Wyatt backed down. Stood shoulder to shoulder with Travis in Texas, and rode with the 7th when Custer went down. Remington showed us how we looked on canvas, and Louis L'Amour has told us his tale. And the highwaymen, they sing about him and wish to God they could have ridden his trail. The old Chisholm Trail is covered in concrete. They truck it to market in 50-foot rigs. They roll by his markings and don't even notice, like living and dying was all he ever did. This is the last cowboy song, the end of 100-year waltz. The voices sound sad as they're singing along. Another piece of America's lost. This is the last cowboy song. This is the last cowboy song. Suggested references. The book, Empire of the Summer Moon. Read the story of Quanah Parker, his mother, Cynthia Ann. This is one of the finest Western history books I've ever read. S.C. Gwynn is the author. It's an amazing story. The book in the middle, Women's Voices from the Oregon Trail. This is a compiling of many of the diaries of the women. I took many of the extracts from here. And of course, the life and legacy of Annie Oakley. It was legendary. Sadly, it's not politically correct to talk about a woman who was a marksman too. But what she did for philanthropy is just a remarkable story. This concludes a presentation of Women of Valor, Women of the West. Let me stop my sharing and see if we can get everybody here. There we go. I'm having trouble getting the, but anybody have any thoughts? I'll just keep working on this and see if anybody have any thoughts or comments that, yes, go ahead. You're on mute. You have to unmute yourself.
How old do they think that Cynthia Parker was when she was kidnapped?
I'm sorry, say that again.
How old do they think Cynthia Parker was when she was
They think she
kidnapped?
was between the age of 6 and 9. I mean, she was a young girl and
Right.
obviously got married very young too.
Well, it seemed like she unlearned everything she had known.
That's about right. That's absolutely about right. And she was at first, she was treated terribly. I mean, she was considered a young slave, and she was really in bondage to the entire tribe, and everybody abused her. It's a very, there had to be something in her persona that was so unusual that caused a native couple to adopt her first, and then to marry a Indian prince. There had to be something, and obviously the fact that what her son did in keeping her name was There was something unusual about her.
She had Quanah Parker, right?
Yes, yes.
Who had one blue eye and one brown eye?
Buffalo Bill was also known for his contributions to women's rights, to charities. He paid women the exact same thing he paid men,
Really? I didn't know that.
which was very unusual back then and still is.
Quanah Parker had one blue eye and one brown eye.
I think if it's of any concern, Max Scherzer, pitcher for the Los Angeles Dodgers, also has that. That makes maybe him a better pitcher, I think. But anyway, I think the important point about this story is how amazing the women of that period were. They had to be. Otherwise, they obviously wouldn't survive. They're in the West. Their own. And very sad. They had lost children. They had no neighbors, no friends. It's a very difficult environment for them. I mean, just we can't imagine what it was like on the Oregon Trail. I mean, just imagine you're driving the wagon and your 10 or 15 children are running around on the prairie. I mean, they're running around because that's all they can do. They're walking and so on. You can imagine the adversity they faced out these holes, getting trapped, Indians, animals, you know.
Snakes.
Yes.
Thank you, Brant. That was a very good program. I enjoyed it.
Okay. Good.
Thank you, Brant.
Thanks, Brent. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you all for coming and see you next month. We'll have a special holiday program. It's almost that time now. Pretty soon.
It is. We're looking forward to it.
Okay.
What about the notorious women next, like Belle Starr?
Oh, no, I talk about good women. Good women.
Okay, that's good.
What about Daisy Gardner?
Yeah. All right. Some people said Belle was very good.
Well, she was.